So there was this description of the holy person, and we've been going through it week by week. And in the first week, we were looking at the descriptor of ghost. So what is it that the holy person, the spiritually mature person, has in common with the ghost? What is it the holy person has in common with the madman? That's what we were looking at last week. And this we'll be looking at what he has or she has in common with a child. Yeah. So why don't we, as we've been doing each week, I thought we could just sort of get together and just discuss that between ourselves. Yeah. So we'll do 4 or 5 minutes, get into groups of 3, and just chuck it about. Yeah. What is it that a holy person has in common with a child? What would you see that is childlike within a holy person? And then I'll ring the bell and we'll come back. We'll come back together again. Okay, great. Okay, good. So what do we think?
Yeah, we were talking about the idea that the child has this sense of innocence and doesn't just take everything for granted. Like when a child's out in nature, they'll see a trail of ants as being actually quite fascinating. Because you grow up and you might not even see it.
Yeah. So everything to a child is sort of beginner's mind, doesn't it? What we talk about in the Zen tradition was beginner's mind, the mind that you take to something when it's brand new, which is said to be spiritually a very positive orientation to things, like they were just sort of brand new each time. And of course for a child it's very often brand new, isn't it? So they take that sense of beginner's mind each time with them. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah. I just remember something a philosopher said, who's Indian, that Krishnamurti. He said that when you tell a child that a bird is called a bird, they'll never see it in the same way again, or something like that.
Right. Yes. Yeah. It's like we narrow things down when we sort of slap a concept on them, don't we? Buddhism very, very strong on this, actually, that as soon as you sort of conceptualize something, you've narrowed it down and sort of limited it in your perception in some sort of way. So as soon as, with a child, they're not yet conceptualizing things in that particular way. They haven't become sort of, and they've definitely not learned sort of how they work mechanically, and they're sort of still full of magic and spirit and everything like that, aren't they? So yeah, that's a good one. Maybe one more. Yeah, Taylor.
I think children often have a real authenticity to them in their playfulness and joy and curiosity, but also with difficult emotions. They'll actually you can watch them deal with them in real time, and because of that, they don't tend to really hold grudges or anything like that.
Yeah.
They're actually processing them. And related to that, they don't succumb to societal conventions so much. They just are doing what they feel.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. If you ever see a child go through the stages of sort of grief over losing a toy, it happens very quickly, doesn't it? And very, very quick. It's like life is over, the world is at an end, but suddenly there's this other toy and it's all right again, isn't it? We sort of stay at life is over for weeks on end, actually, don't we? But we don't do it in the same way that a child does it. So thankfully, that's probably a good thing, I would imagine, in a large part. But yes, it's much more sort of, a child is much more real and spontaneous, isn't it, in that way? When I was thinking about this talk again, what came back to me last week, we were talking about Padam Samva, and those that were here that week will have heard that Padam Samva was a figure that took the Dharma, that took the Buddha's teaching from India and brought it to Tibet. And he's a sort of historical / mythical figure, partly legendary, partly historical. And there's a life story of Padam Samva that's very, very important text in the Tibetan tradition, and full of sort of myth and magic, like just completely full of mystery. You'll see his figure at times. Actually, I should have brought a painting, but anyway, too late now. But Padam Samva, in this particular life story, held very, very deeply important to the Tibetan tradition. his birth story is given particular importance. And in his birth story, what happens is that, well, the particular land of Tibet at the time, there's this king, King Udayana, King Indrabodhi, and his kingdom is basically falling apart. It's basically falling apart. They've got plagues and locusts, you know, the way, you know, it's sort of biblical, basically. That's how they do it in ancient Tibet as well. You know, there's plagues and locusts and earthquakes and disease and everything. The land is just going to rack, basically. It's going completely falling apart. And the king is just completely struggling to know what to do, because it's seen back then when your kingdom fell apart, it was seen, the problem was seen as spiritual. It's seen as fundamentally spiritual. So if the king hadn't sort of developed spirituality, encouraged spirituality, and followed what would be deemed as the best form of spirituality, that would be reflected in his society. That was how it was thought about. And so the king is looking for a solution. He's desperately needing a solution. And one day one of his courtiers, one of his assistants, finds in the middle of Lake the middle of the lake Danakosha, this beautiful 8-year-old boy, completely radiant, shining, beautiful 8-year-old boy, in the middle of a lotus, sort of fully manifested. So that's how Padam Samva was said to be born. He was born in the middle of Lake Danakosha, in the middle of a lotus, fully unfolded lotus. Sat there in meditation posture. Yeah? And well, you've always got to look at things like that in myth. What is it that about an 8-year-old boy that seems important in this particular myth here? And one of the things that struck me immediately in sort of reading this life story of Padam Samva is that it's a world that an 8-year-old boy would be, or an 8-year-old girl would be, much more at home in than necessarily we would be today as adults, as sort of common sense, modern, sensible adults. This world is completely sort of magical and mysterious. Everything has life, yeah? All the rivers have life, all the wind has life, the elements have life, the mountains have life, the trees are associated with spirits, the mountains would be associated with gods, there'd be sky gods, there'd be water gods, there'd be sprites. That would just be the natural outlook of ancient peoples in those time, and Tibetan Buddhists still today as well, particularly in Tibet. So you've got this completely sort of magical world, and that's a world that we're often much, much more at home with when we're children, aren't we? There's this sense when we're children of the world being completely alive. I remember we used to do sort of a scouts thing during the summer, and what they used to do was they used to get us to find the fairy in the forest, yeah? You go find the fairy in the forest and you sort of run around. The adults would really get into it. Like they were more like enthusiastic than the kids. They were like, it was fantastic. But the sort of scout leaders would really get into it, and they'd all be like, okay, now we have to go search for clues. So we go around this forest and we'd start searching for clues, and clues could be anything. Clues, I remember we found a sort of marigold washing up glove one day, and it was pointing in a particular direction, and that was it. That was the fairies den, yeah. So that we sort of were off in that direction. We never found it, unfortunately, but each week, my gosh, we did try. And you were immediately in this world of magic. That's very much the world of the Buddha as well. If you go back to the time of the Buddha, his whole world is just filled with colour and mystery and magic. That was just the assumed world. It's not even mentioned as a thing. That's just the world that it got sort of packaged up with. So it's interesting, say for example, there's no word for animism, which is what we're referring to, the sense that the world is alive, that the elements are alive, that trees are alive, mountains are alive, streams are alive. You won't find that word in traditional societies, including in the Buddha's time. You won't find any word for animism in the Pali Canon, for example, the record of the Buddha's teachings, because it's the assumed thing. Yeah? As soon as when something is named, like we as sort of modern folk, we give a name to something and it becomes a sort of thing. But when it's not named, it's the sort of water you swim in, if you get me. So there's no term for this in the Buddha's Pali Canon, and it's a completely alive sort of universe. And very often you'll have the intervention of these sort of sprites and various demons and things like that. Oftentimes, for example, the Buddha is called upon to try and overcome some particularly sort of cheeky forest sprite. Yeah, and in one particular instance, people are saying, no, you can't go in there. This one particular fire demon, you can't go into there. You'll be got by the fire demon. And out he comes with the fire demon, just sort of sat in the palm of his hand. Yeah, so this is completely sort of inherent to the Buddha's world, and similar with ours. Yeah, if you look back to the sort of Greek and Roman myth, that's exactly what happens. If you read the Odyssey, for example, or the Iliad is an account of a great battle between who was it between? Troy, that's right, yeah. And the Athenians? The Greeks, all the Greeks. Okay. But the whole, it's tragic because I read it. It's really not good. I don't remember it either. But what I do remember of it, other than the details, was this sense that you always had interventions from this outside world, the outside world of the environment of gods, of goddesses. They were always sort of weighing in on things. They were always looking to sort of lean one way or the other, give advantage one way or the other, depending on sort of who found their favour. So again, in our own Western tradition, we come from traditions that were completely alive. Now that's totally the world of children, isn't it? It's the world of kids. Like, we lose that as we grow older. We sort of become sensible or something, or our parents tell us, oh no, that's just for kids, or that's just sort of superstitiousness, or that's just sort of magic, it doesn't really exist. And of course what we lose then is something very, very tangible, in the sense of something of mystery and magic in the world. The world becomes much sort of flatter and 2D, doesn't it? When you lose that sense of kind of mystery and magic, it becomes much more kind of just kind of 2D and flat. It's interesting, for example, that this evening we're going to be celebrating the full moon. Kashmitra, I think you're going to be leading a puja after the class. And the full moon is very, very significant in the Buddhist tradition. All of the significant major events that happened in the Buddhist tradition happened on the full moon. Say, for example, the Buddha's birth, when he gained enlightenment, when he died, all of these significant instances happened on the full moon. And it's seen to be because that the full moon gives a particular spiritual intensity at that time. You might have noticed this yourself, for example. We've got a full moon, obviously, at the moment, and we've got this incredible blood red moon. Have you noticed that? Like, it's absolutely amazing. And I get a little bit sort of like when the full moon comes on. I have 2 or 3 days of like, I don't know what that is, but I get a little, and I'm often lying awake in the middle of the night, and I get like very intense dreams and sometimes nightmares and things like that. And you mention it to people, I'm not sleeping very well. And I go, no, I'm not sleeping very well either. Must be the full moon. And even people who are completely sort of scientific in their outlook go, yeah, must be the full moon. As if that just didn't completely undermine everything you thought about the world. It's not going to be the gravity of the full moon that's doing that to your dreams. But right through the Buddhist tradition, it's seen as being a particularly potent time for meditation, for ritual, for confession, for all of those things that are important in the spiritual life, because it's seen to have more efficacy during that time. Whatever it is that I'm sure there's reasons, detailed reasons given, but I don't know them, but that the full moon lends more weight to things, either possibly for good or for bad. It's interesting, just sort of taking last week into account. We were talking about the Madman, but apparently this term lunatic comes from lunar. It comes from lunar, and the idea that actually the moon tend to heighten destabilizing sort of emotions or mind states for those that were sort of maybe particularly prone to them. So that term comes from the moon. So there, right is right embedded into our language, and we don't sometimes we don't pay enough attention to these things. Even, and I want to try something, but even at this, it's interesting that particularly where the universe is said to get involved is at the point of commitment. That the universe in the Buddhist tradition is said to particularly like commitment. Like the point when somebody commits to something is when you'll get help. You see this, say, for example, in the Buddha's life story, when the Buddha decides to leave home, to go forth from home and in search of nirvana, he steals out in the middle of the night, and this really incredible, beautiful instance of the world intervening, the devas are said to sort of cushion the horse's hooves as he leaves the palace, to muffle the sound of the hooves so that he won't be found. So the universe is particularly seeing the Buddha's commitment, the significance of that commitment, and the devas put their hands under the horse's hooves as it goes out of the palace. Incredibly sort of beautiful scene, isn't it, where it's like the universe just gets involved. You might have had that in your own life, where you eventually just decide to sort of commit to something. That's when things start to happen, magic starts to happen. So we live in this world, according to Buddhism, which is just totally alive. And of course we lose it. We're very much in touch with it as children, and then we lose it oftentimes as adults. So I really like to bring this quite explicitly back into my practice, and so one of the things that I'm doing when I teach the Metta Bhavana is on the final stage of the Metta Bhavana. Traditionally, the way that you do the Metta Bhavana is mostly the final stage, it's the fifth stage. That's how the Buddha would have taught it. But very, very explicitly in this stage of the Metta Bhavana, you're encouraged to send metta, to send love, to send well-wishing to the non-material beings. Human beings, animals as well, plants, vegetable life, all of those things, but also very explicitly in the Buddhist tradition to the non-material beings. And I like to say this in a beginner's class. I say, okay, so in the final stage, we send well-wishing to all living beings, including the goblins and the sprites, and I say it with a very dead face, the sprites and the tree spirits and the ghouls and the ghosts, and you get these people like, oh my God, looking to run for the door. But I thought what we could do now, and I like to bring this, like every time I do the Metta Bhavana, I try to include this aspect. Now, one of the things that children can do is they can just play pretend. So if you don't believe in tree sprites and ghouls and goblins, I don't care. Let's just see if we can play pretend that you do. That's mostly actually of most significance in Buddhism, is usually the effect of the belief on you. It's not so much the rightness or wrongness of it sort of metaphysically. It's the effect of it on you. So what I thought we could do is I'll lead us through a bit of a Metta Bhavana just with this orientation, so that it's not maybe your usual Metta Bhavana, but one that maybe opens you more into this world of the child and more into this world of mystery and magic. So why don't we do that? Why don't we set up? Great. So what did we think? How did that go? What was people's responses to it?
I thought it was kind of magical. All these people here in this room connecting to the world as it possibly is on a truer level. It was really moving.
Yeah, good. Yeah, good. Yeah. So there's definitely a sort of sense of maybe connecting to something that maybe you're sending well-wishing to something that you wouldn't have given much thought to in a certain sense before. It's a very traditional practice. That is the traditional metabhavana. It's not how we teach it now. Maybe we should go back to teaching it that way. But that is a very traditional metabhavana. That's how the Buddha would have taught it. Human beings would have been but a fraction of the total number of beings inhabiting the universe. And I would have only mentioned a fraction of them there. If you look at the Buddha's teaching and the cosmological vision of the Buddha, it's just full of those beings, full of those universes, worlds of beings. Anybody else? Yeah?
I think like a lot of the moments where I feel like the most like connected and open-hearted is when I'm like in nature and feeling those kind of elemental forces. So it's quite easy to wish those things met up because I'm already quite open-hearted anyway. It's quite a nice like springboard into that one. It feels quite like tangible.
Yeah. It's interesting. Sangharajali, the man who founded the Triratna Buddhist movement, he was talking on a particular order member retreat once how there was a certain set of trees nearby where they were staying, and the feeling he got from was that they weren't welcome, people weren't welcome there, which is interesting. He thought, you don't know, maybe people hadn't had a particularly good influence amongst the trees, but he got a very strong sense that they weren't welcome there. You do get that. Sometimes you sort of get a sense, you walk into a woods and the woods feels welcoming, or it feels not welcoming in some sort of way. And human beings are highly attuned to these sort of things, but we rarely understand. One, in A, we get a sense it gives us the creeps, and that's what we'll talk about it. Or B, it's sort of lovely and enchanted or something like that. We oftentimes are tuned into it, but don't have really much of a sort of theory of the world that explains it to us very well, I think. Yeah. You walk in, you go to places in nature where, and for whatever reason, they have a good sort of psychological atmosphere to them, or a not so good one, a not so inviting one, don't they? Yeah. In Buddhism, it would sometimes be said that something possibly had happened there as well. You get resonances. People talk about when they come into the centre, for example, into the courtyard, they just get a sense of the place being positive. And that's just, and it could be empty, but it's just the resonance of what people have done here as well. Anyway, it's slightly off the topic. Anybody else? Yeah.
Just on the topic of nature, I just feel like whenever I spend 45 minutes or half an hour, any like decent amount of time, I've actually always consistently relaxed. And I think there is like a threshold where if there are frequencies in nature, then you can absorb them, but if we're always in concrete boxes or in like urban spaces, we can't. And I think that threshold is worth exploring.
Yes, yeah. I really find that. I mean, other people might get that as well, that I just need to get out of London, like at least probably a day, at least a month. I just need to get out of London and just sort of connect with that. It was a story, there's a carers a sort of event that takes place downstairs, and oftentimes they bring them out on retreat, and they're oftentimes, they're local, they're Bangladeshi women who, care for sick parents or kids or whatever it might be. And there was a story of one woman particularly arriving at a retreat in the retreat centre in Vidrasana, and obviously it's just surrounded by nature, and just breaking into tears, just falling into tears. She'd never been in the countryside before. She just fell into tears. And I think that can be the sort of moving effect. So Buddhism, it's interesting because I think Buddhism has sort of, it's got a reputation. It's become the religion or the spiritual form for rational, sort of scientifically minded Westerners who have grown up in Christianity most often, and think, oh, well, I want something rational, I want something scientific. And it might be that, look, they've been brought up in a particularly superstitious universe. I think this mystery and magic is different from superstition. Superstition is more often the literalizing of all of this sort of stuff. One thing that Sangharakshita, the man who founded Sri Ratna, always said, look, don't think of this literally, in the sense that we might think of like you and me as a being in a tree with an agency like you and me. Don't sort of, although there might be something of that, don't sort of literalize it in that way. Superstition often literalizes things in that way, where it takes something that is true on a level, it takes the mystery and the magic and it puts it down in creeds, so that all of a sudden it becomes kind of understandable and very kind of mechanical all of a sudden. Like it takes that magic and it makes it mechanical again. Like, so you have to tend the sacred fire for 20 years or 40 years or whatever it might be. Well, it takes something that is as true and mysterious and magical, say, about fire, and then it credulizes that or literalizes that to the point that it becomes actually just mechanical again. Actually, it takes the mystery away from it. So that, people sometimes come from superstitious backgrounds in that particular way, and maybe they don't want to get away from that. But they think then that Buddhism is a scientific and a rational view of the universe. And it's just not. If you go into any of the traditional teachings of the Buddha, it takes place in an alive world, in a magical world. And oftentimes it's been sort of, that has been shorn from it, maybe because Western Buddhists are a bit embarrassed of it, or they don't want to sort of scare people off, or they think people aren't into it, or whatever it might be. So it all gets sort of tucked aside as maybe being a bit embarrassing or something like that. But it's most definitely part of the Buddhist universe. Sangharakshita once said that he didn't think enlightenment was possible in a dead universe. So those that thought that universe was dead, was just matter, was just the mechanical sort of movement of matter taking place according to sort of Newtonian physics, or any variety of physics that's just matter, that doesn't involve consciousness or consciousness in some sort of way in that whole kind of vision of the universe. That enlightenment wasn't possible in that particular world. So it's an interesting thing to sort of dwell on. What is it that makes enlightenment impossible? Just thinking of the world in a sort of dead, mechanical kind of way like that. But the other thing I was thinking in terms of the 8-year-old child, the 8-year-old boy in this particular instance, the radiant sort of 8-year-old boy, is and some people mentioned it a bit earlier, was kids are particularly spontaneous in this way, aren't they? They're just sort of, they've not been conventionalized or socialized yet. There's a good side to that. There is a bad side to that as well, as anybody who has kids knows. But there's a good side to that, in that a lot of the ways that we sort of make ourselves polite and conventional dampens down our capacity for spontaneity, for creativity, for all of those things. You just look at kids start to interact, and all of a sudden you've got this sort of raw kind of spontaneity to them. I was on the tube the other day, and I was stood. I'd gone swimming with a friend, and we were on the way back, and I was stood up, and there was this kid, must have been around this age, maybe around 8 or something like that, and he was just with his mum, young white English kid. The colour is important, and I'll say why in a moment. But in came in this stop, and this enormous young black guy, huge, really muscular, tatted up, everything like that, came and sat down next to him. And this kid just turns around and goes to him, "How'd you get so big?" And this guy said, "Oh, well, when your mum tells you to eat your vegetables." He says, I ate my vegetables. That's how I got that big. Like, wow. This kid's like, wow, you ate your vegetables. He was like, yeah, eat your broccoli and your carrots. You'll get that big as well. And it was a fantastic little interaction, and only a sort of interaction that you could have only had with an 8-year-old boy, basically, or 8-year-old child, 8-year-old boy or girl, that just sort of spontaneously like, how'd you get so big? And you get that with kids, don't you? If parents don't train them out of that, which ideally they shouldn't, you will get that. They'll be sort of spontaneous, and oftentimes they'll just sort of embarrass you, won't you? So you have to say, no, we don't talk to strangers or whatever it might be. But actually I think it might have been his mum or his grandmother was with him, just, really was just sort of encouraged them, and they all got chatting, and everybody actually, as it happened, everybody just got sort of chatting. This little one interaction just opened everybody up, because everybody was just sort of sat in the tube. It was stuck for a bit, and everybody just sort of got chatting a bit. So this one little risk that this child takes just opens up this sort of connection with people. And you often get that in London, don't you? If you just take a risk with people, if you're just more childlike and take a risk. People can have a bit of a shell in London, is what I've noticed, but oftentimes people really welcome in people sort of breaking beyond it. It's only a sort of cultural habit that we have not to do that more. You could go somewhere else, people would just talk. You get on a train in India, everybody talks. But it takes the child to sort of give it a shot. It takes a child to sort of take a risk and give it a shot like that. So children are much more sort of spontaneous, and it does go back to last week that it's one of the problems with becoming conventionalized and polite is that we lose that capacity to take risks and ask somebody how they got so big, how they got so muscular. So the ability to play, the ability just to be sort of playful in our interactions. If there's a very famous Buddhist poet called Ryokan, who he was a Zen poet, and he liked a beer for a start, so he was an unconventional type of guy. You read his poetry is really amazing. If you ever go on solitary retreat or just retreat at all, there'll often be a copy of Ryokan in the library. Pick it up and read it. It's really fantastic. He was always drinking sake. The poems often start with drunk on sake, and then off you go from there. But oftentimes he was meant to be, as part of his being a monk, he goes and wants to he has to beg from the local villagers, and he gets pulled aside by the local children who just love him. They won't let him go around and do his alms rounds, because the kids all just want him to play. They all sort of drag on his sleeve and bring him off, and of course he obliges them. And he writes a lot about these childlike interactions that he has with the local village kids in this poetry. And the whole sense is of sort of spontaneity, play, creativity, lightness of heart, taking things lightly. All of those things that we sort of lose and become kind of heavy with responsibility and drive and ambition and all of it. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with any of those things, and in fact they're important, but to the extent that they sort of laden us down and make us incapable of just being sort of playful and spontaneous. So Ryokan sort of writes and talks a lot about that as well in his poetry, and it's really, really fantastic poetry. You don't want to make too much of this. I mean, children can be real Machiavellian little feckers as well. I remember I had to take care of my aunt's youngest boy, my cousin, for a while, and I'd bring him to the playground. And you ever watch kids in the playground? They're the most cunning, deceitful little. It's like one alliance is made and broken every 2 seconds. It's like, you're my friend, you're not my friend, you're my friend, you're not my friend, I betrayed you, I stabbed you in the back, ha ha ha, it's like, we're friends again, it's all this sort of stuff. So it's not like, we do need to be socialized, don't we? Because we do need to take our place within society. I think this is important in all of these weeks, what we're talking about, because they can be read individualistically and anti-socially, if you get me. We do actually need to take our place in society, and we do need to become sort of, in a sense, citizens, you could say, in that regard, who have responsibilities and duties to their fellow citizens. Yeah, so we do need to do that. We do need to be socialized, and we do need to be socialized as kids into adults who can take their place in the world amongst a world of adults as well. But what you don't want to lose is the sort of capacity to be childlike as well at the same time, and it's hard to do both of those things, I think. Yeah. The other thing that I think that kids often have that we lose as we become adults is this sort of very, very strong sense of energy about them. You ever walk into like a house where there's kids in the house, and it's just the level of energy, and parents stop hearing it, don't they? They sort of like racket that comes from kids, and up and down the kitchen, up and down, and it's like back and forth. And it becomes an absolute racket, and there's just the energy that often is just phenomenal, you know, running about, tearing about. And again, we sort of lose it as we become older, don't we? So it's like, how do we get our energy behind things? I find this difficult, you know. How is it I get my sort of energy up, my energy behind the things that I'm doing, the energy behind the stuff that I have to do or that I want to do? Oftentimes, it seems like spiritual life for me is trying to figure out this koan of how to hold and direct more and more energy in my life. Have the capacity to sit with more energy without sort of dribbling it away or looking to sort of spend it in some pointless pursuit, I don't know, Instagram or something like that, or just get rid of it. We often find energy very uncomfortable, don't we? Like if we've got to, like you go on retreat and you build this really strong well of energy. And in that sense, it's a much deeper energy than childlike energy. It's a quiet sort of deep energy. And we feel uncomfortable with it. We don't like it. The amount of energy there we're not used to. And so the first thing we do when we come off retreat very often is just blow it. Just get rid of it because we're uncomfortable with it. We're uncomfortable with the level of positivity behind it as well. So we have to sort of learn how to sort of work with energy in our lives and be able to access energy as well. You know that old saying, their heart wasn't in it. You know, when you do something but your heart's not in it. It's the suggestion is there's something not in it, be it your emotional life or your energy, your energic life, whatever it might be. That's just not sort of behind it. So our energy gets stuck. Our energy gets stuck. For so many of us, when we first walk into the Buddhist center, what we realize is that our energy is just stuck. Why do we think that is? Why does our energy get stuck? Why does it not flow very well?
Because we're not aware of it.
We're not aware of it? Yeah. Could you say a little bit more?
We're not aware how it fully functions and how it works. So
Right.
the correct outlet is to work.
Yes.
You should put it towards, so
Yeah.
then we sort of get hypnotized by it. Or other people hijack it by saying
Yeah.
this is important and you need to believe
Yeah,
this,
that's
and then you put all your energy in there.
Yes. I think that's right, isn't it? Because our energy and the way our energy behaves is very uniquely ours. Like it's not necessarily, it'll be unique to us. And the way that it responds will be unique to us. And the way that it arises will be unique to us. And the way that we sabotage it will be unique to us as well. And a lot of spiritual life, the difficult job of integration and integrating our energies is just learning how they work. Getting access to them, getting them moving, getting them behind something when maybe we don't want to do it, but we need to do it, but especially getting behind something that we want to do, just having energy flow. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Just have somebody else maybe. Yeah, Jim.
Maybe if you're like criticized for it, like being too energetic.
Yeah.
That'll do it.
Well, maybe our energy has got us into trouble.
Yeah.
Maybe in something that we've done, it's got us into trouble at some point, and so yeah, we've learned to bury it as well. Sometimes that can be even our positive energy. Sometimes it can get us into trouble, can't we? Or sort of like it's not responded to in the way that we we might have hoped it to be. Yeah. Sangharakshita thought that her energy would very often get stuck, and he thought there was a few different reasons why it would, why we didn't have more access to this childlike energy. And he thought one of them was very often we're in jobs that deaden our energy. So we're in jobs that we don't want to do, that we are a chore for us, are basically just a duty for us that we can't get our heart behind. And very often when our energy isn't behind something, it just stagnates, doesn't it? We can't sort of get it to kind of move. And after a time, if we do that year on year, decade on decade, we might not have access to energy at all. You do see people like this, it's people that come jaded, don't you? Like they've been doing a job that they've just disliked or hated for decades, and maybe just for the money or because they've got responsibilities so they don't know what else to do. And they just completely sort of deadened by it. So not doing what we want to do, or not sort of or doing work that basically deadens us in some way that we can't get our energy behind. The other thing that he thought actually was related to this story of the tube, which was the inability to communicate, or the lack of opportunity to communicate. So very often, say for example, our energy gets stifled or stuck because we can't communicate to people very well. That's often happens in London, doesn't it? Like people can lead very desperately lonely lives in London, and I came to the spiritual life like this as well. And I was just very, very isolated and lonely. And I didn't have a capacity to sort of communicate what was important to me in that sort of flow of energy that you get with communication. Like, you know, when you sort of just connect with somebody through communication, and all of a sudden that energy is flowing, or you're having a conversation with somebody and suddenly you just hit on something where the both of you are emotionally engaged, and suddenly the energy of the conversation and the energy of the communication is just taken upwards. And very often so many people, because they don't get to communicate on the depth of that level, i.e. on what's very, very important to them, or what inspires them, or what moves them, that energy that would be given rise to through that communication just sits and goes stagnant. So communication, very, very important, and that's one of the things that we always look to offer here at the London Buddhist Centre, is a place where people can form friendships whereby they can communicate on what's most important to them and what's of most meaning to them, because that's where we start to get our energy flowing, and that's where what's important to us and meaning to us can start to come to life and actually sort of activate in our life and kind of have life in that particular sense. Okay. So what I thought we could do is just have a little bit of more meditation now. I won't say any more.
Could I just say one?
No, sorry, Yusuf. No. So we're going to go on. We're going to do a little bit of meditation, and Akash Mitra is going to have the ritual, the full moon ritual after this. So do stay for that. I'll be there. Do stay for that, and we'll have a little bit of magic then, hopefully. But now, why don't we just settle and do some meditation, and we'll leave it at that.